This is Scott Naso and his little girl Laila, who lost a wife and mother to cancer. Why was this grieving father cast into one of the most emotional and disturbing family court battles in Rhode Island? Scott Naso lost his wife Sherry to breast cancer. She was only 37 years old, and their baby girl Laila lost her mother. In the immediate aftermath of Sherry's death, tensions escalated with Sherry's parents. And let me show you a picture there of, let me get my slideshow out. This is one of the most emotional cases I have ever seen. So here's some pictures for you guys. All right, so that's the family right there. And so as soon as Sherry died of breast cancer, which actually went into her brain, um, tensions really started to heat up with Sherry's parents, who were very strict, very controlling Iranian parents. Now, Scott investigated and raised concerns about their medical treatment of Sherry. I mean, they were both doctors, and according to Scott, very controlling, and had been overprescribing his wife's medication, which in turn masked her cancer symptoms. Can you imagine that? And the cancer returned in the form of a brain tumor, which killed her. So Scott claims their actions reached the level of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And he believes if Sherry had not followed their advice, she'd be alive today. And you know what? There's more. Scott came home after Sherry died, only to find Laila, his little girl, just a toddler, pinned down on the floor by her grandparents. And he recalls her screaming and struggling while medicine was forced into her mouth with an oral syringe. Now, as a parent, Scott felt it was in the best interest of Laila not to see her grandparents. And they just did not respect boundaries. And I get that because I'm a mother myself. So as a result, the grandparents filed suit in Rhode Island demanding visitation and claiming that they had legal rights as grandparents to see their granddaughter. Within days, a shattered family would descend into a legal war that now raises one of the most explosive questions in family law. When can the state override the decisions of a surviving parent in favor of grandparents who believe they know what's best for a child? So today we're going to translate this case through the lens of the law. Who gets to decide what is best for a child after tragedy? A grieving parent, is it, or a judge, grandparents? And how much power should the government have to interfere with a fit decisions like Scott Naso? So joining me today, I'm very lucky to discuss the broader legal implications of this case is Scott Naso's attorney, Veronica Assalone. So I'm going to put her up and take my slideshow. I have a slideshow which will show more pictures as the case goes on, but let me remove the slideshow and I'm going to introduce Veronica. So Veronica, I'm going to add you to the stage here in 1 second. So I have to go back to here. Veronica, there you are. Welcome.
Good morning, Margaret.
It's such a pleasure to have you on my show to discuss the law. And, it's again, yes. And again, this case is it's just so awful. And when I say awful, I mean, it's just, to me, it's a tragedy that Scott had to go through this as a grieving parent. So let's start out with what made this case so unusual legally, Veronica?
Really a perfect storm in that, well, I could go on forever about how unusual it was. We've got a fit parent by all accounts. So a concedingly fit parent. The grandparents admitted on day one that that he was fit. He
Okay.
is a widow. He is a detective. He is a civil servant who was up against in a David versus Goliath fight against multi-millionaire grandparents. And the procedural history was very, very unique. And the constitutional challenge that we have raised and is now pending before the Rhode Island Supreme Court is something that makes this case fascinating, as well as the underlying facts about the grandparents' behavior throughout the course of their marriage, Scott and Sherry's marriage,
Okay.
after subsequent to Sherry's death.
And can you tell what was like that in Scott's words? And I know this is Scott testified under oath at trial. And can you tell us a little bit about what was happening toward or before Sherry died? I know they were very controlling. And are we dealing with different culture here? What was going on?
Yes. So Scott had a very loving and trusting relationship with his in-laws, both prior to the marriage and throughout the marriage until Layla was born. At that point, they had a role in Layla's birth, in that Sherry could not, due to her being in remission from breast cancer and the medication that she was on, they had to have Layla through surrogacy and a donated egg. And the grandparents assisted in that. It's a very, very expensive process, and they insisted in that. And when Layla was born, Scott says it was the happiest day of both of their lives. The grandparents practically moved in. They had a huge presence in their marital home. Scott and Sherry began to argue about boundaries that were not being honored. And that was of some significant conflict, or became a significant conflict in their marriage. Um, the as time went on, Sherry began to feel sick again. And Sherry had an oncology team in your neck of the woods. Dana-Farber, one of the best around. And
Absolutely.
what people don't understand, and what we haven't spoke about enough, and I want to make very clear, because the grandparents tried to suggest that the medication that they were prescribing for Sherry and the medical advice they were giving to Sherry was somehow benign, but Scott believes it had an enormous impact on Sherry's demise. Because at Dana-Farber, if you are a cancer survivor, a breast cancer survivor, there is no screens. There are regular checkups, first 3 months at a time and then 6 months at a time, but they do not do screening. It is an interview about symptoms. And if you're not reporting symptoms, they do not take the necessary action of screening for cancer, being out of remission, because screens can cause cancer. Having any kind of screens can cause cancer. So they rely very heavily on a patient reporting symptoms. And Scott learned in the last year of Sherry's life that her father was prescribing 26 different medications that masked symptoms of her cancer returning.
That's awful.
Horrific.
And what kind of medications, roughly, were they?
Medications. So the testimony and what Scott discovered was medications that would mask incapacitating dizziness. Now, let's remember that ultimately they found a golf-sized brain tumor and metastasized cancer throughout her body. Also in her lungs, he prescribed medication, including an inhaler. Sherry was not asthmatic. Antibiotics for lung and breathing issues. Prednisone, which is not something that you can't take an aspirin without reporting that to Dana-Farber. So one of the requirements, if you ever treat a family member, which is not really allowed ethically in Rhode Island and pursuant to the American Medical Association, you need to be reporting that to her actual providers and her medical team. And grandfather admitted he never did that. And so Dana-Farber didn't know that she was on all of these medications, masking the fact that her cancer was back. And then grandmother was telling her not to seek medical intervention for the symptoms that she was showing.
That seems so odd that they would do that.
You mentioned that culture. There definitely was a cultural aspect here.
Mhm.
Sherry was an only child of two
Yeah.
Iranian immigrants. And there was, while it was by all accounts a loving relationship. She did not have the autonomy as for someone, a 37-year-old. Scott found a really compelling um, list that Sherry had created for herself, almost as a New Year's resolution, in her 30s, as part of a Google document that Sherry created. And on it were things like learning how to deposit a paycheck, learning how to deposit a
Oh,
check,
wow.
learning how to
Wow.
do laundry, learning how to pack Scott lunches. I mean, she was, by all accounts, a very sheltered daughter, only child of these grandparents, and they yielded a lot of psychological and emotional control over her.
Oh, yeah. And, it sounds like would you say, I mean, if it came out in trial, because I'm really curious about what came out in trial, did this, cultural difference come up, and was there a cultural difference as far as the practice of medicine, or would that be about the same?
They were educated, my recollection is, in Iran prior to coming to the United States in the 80s.
Mhm.
However, they were, Dr. Garishi grandfather was a board certified pediatrician. I want to stress pediatrician. He treated children. What the American Medical Association warns about as it relates to their ethical rules is not to ever treat your family members, because if you do, boundaries
Mhm.
tend to be blurred. And one of the things that they are concerned with is that family members will practice outside the scope of their expertise, and that's exactly what he did. He was treating her for gastrointestinal issues, wrongly, by the way. He
Mm.
prescribed her an antipsychotic for what he diagnosed as gastroparesis. This is all in the last year of her life,
Oh
when
my god.
cancer was growing.
Yeah, I have a slide of what they look like. Um, so these are the grandparents, and both from Iran, and I believe that was taken at some point during the trial. But so tell me legally, let's talk about how the trial started. I think I explained in the opening where, Scott, oh yeah, the Scott came allegedly, according to Scott, he came home and saw the grandfather, who's right here, um, forcing medication. I guess they both had the child, Layla, pinned down, and they were forcing medication into her throat. So
Well,
what happened there? Allegedly.
let me back up,
Okay.
because I think it's relevant to understand the following. In the weeks prior to Sherry's death, Scott was begging her to see a neurologist, to go to the hospital. She was essentially on a couch most of the time. She could not move. Her gait was unsteady. Her face was drooping to one side. She was drooling out of the side of her mouth. When drinking water, it would dribble out of her mouth. And he begged her to get medical intervention. And when he attempted to do that, grandmother would push him away and tell him he's not a doctor, he's just a cop, to back off, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And then grandmother would be telling her there's nothing wrong with her, that she was withdrawing from Prozac. She
Oh my
couldn't
God.
walk. She couldn't drink without dribbling it out of the side of her mouth. So Scott planned an intervention. He has dear, wonderful, supportive friends, the Morgans, and their father happens to be a neurologist. So Scott begged Sherry to come out to dinner with their friends, Mary Jane and Mike, to their home for dinner. And that's where they had Dr. Morgan waiting to evaluate her. And Dr. Morgan took one look at her and said, this woman has either had a stroke or she has a brain tumor. And he called in a special favor so that she could get screening the next morning on a weekend. And that screening showed a Gulf-sized brain tumor. And they left right from his home to the emergency room at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where she had emergency brain surgery. During that evening, Sherry said, "My mom says I'm just withdrawing from Prozac," and he said, "Get your mother on the phone right now." And he had to tell grandmother, Dr. Corsand, that her daughter was not withdrawing from Prozac and needed a screen. And one of the first things that grandmother said was, "Can it wait?"
Oh my gosh.
The next day, again, they went to the emergency room where the
There's the
emergency
grandmother.
brain surgery took place. And Scott barely ever left her side in the 10 or 11 days thereafter. She never regained consciousness. During that time, Margaret, both doctors gave up their practice. Both doctors closed down their practice. Dr. Garishi at the time he testified between 800 and 1,000 patients. He closed his practice down overnight. And Dr. Corsan, grandmother, was chief pathologist at 3 different hospitals and gave up her practice, retired from her practice. Neither parent ever visited Sherry at the hospital.
Why was that? Did they say anything about that at trial, or did it not come out? I mean,
Um,
that's weird.
in a published article, I think grandmother is quoted as saying that Sherry didn't want them to visit at the hospital. And in another quote, I think they say that grandmother couldn't bear going to see her daughter in that condition, I think. But I think that the public can draw an inference about what was going on there. And so on the day that Sherry died, getting to the prednisone incident, Scott, I don't know if you've ever lost a loved one from cancer, but usually folks at the hospital know when when death is near. And so
Yeah. I
Scott was
lost my dad to
my
cancer, but
mom.
he was 100, so
Yeah. I
it
lost my
it
mother when she was young of a brain tumor. So it certainly, I certainly had an emotional connection to the facts in this case.
Oh, yeah.
And
Oh
or I
my
could
gosh.
understand how nurses sort of tell you it's going to be time, today is probably the day.
Yep.
Scott called the grandparents. He was in touch with them every day. They were in fact at home at some points caring for Layla along with his wonderful village of amazing friends. And he said, "Hey, you've got to come up to the hospital now. Today is going to be the day." And they responded, "I think we'll pass."
Oh my gosh, this makes me wanna I feel like I'm tearing up.
It's
It's
devastating.
so sad. Oh my god.
Before she died, so talk about control. So
Mm.
Scott standing there at her bedside, watching her waste away. And before she died, they were on the phone with him, texting him about where they wanted her buried and how they were going to have Dr. Garishi's office manager, who testified in this case in very interesting ways, that they were going to have her make the funeral arrangements and they were going to dictate where she was going to be buried, which by the way was like an hour and a half away from where Scott and Sherry lived. And Scott
Mm.
said, "This is not the time for this." And this is while she was still alive, but they did
Oh
not
my
come to the
gosh.
hospital and ultimately did not go to the funeral.
That's crazy. I mean, I
When
don't get it.
when
The
Scott arrived home that night, um, there was again this loving village of family and friends waiting for him there, including grandparents at his home. And so there were witnesses around. It wasn't just Scott who witnessed what happened. There were witnesses ready to testify had the case not been dismissed after the grandparents rested, that were so disturbed by what they saw, which is both grandparents, not just grandmother and grandfather, pinning down Layla on the ground and shoving prednisone without Scott's knowledge or consent down her throat. Prednisone, which is unequivocally not okay to be giving a child at that age. Scott later learned it was like the second or third time she had been administered prednisone, which is a heavy, heavy medication
Yeah.
and something that Scott actually was warned about because that day he was asked to pick up a prescription for prednisone, suggesting that she had croup. And one of his friends, who is a paramedic, said, "Hey, this is a really, really heavy medication to be giving a child. And I'd think twice before you give your daughter this." And so Scott elected not to. And Layla seemed fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Prednisone is a steroid, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, yeah. In fact, I was just, I was just not diagnosed. I had a terrible, terrible cold, and I was prescribed that, and it was. I didn't take it. I
No,
actually Googled it, and I'm like, "You know what? This is so strong." I don't and they said there are side effects to it, so I'm like, "I'm not gonna take this," and it's still sitting here. So, I can't imagine giving that to one of my children as look at little Layla there in the slide. She was just a little toddler. So that
it's
would raise see, I would be so upset as a mother. I would have done worse. I would have God knows what I would have done. But how
Scott was
awful.
Scott, did not know. He was working all the time. Sherry was a stay-at-home mom. He
Mhm.
had no idea that ethically that grandfather should not have been Layla's doctor under any circumstances, both by the rules of Rhode Island Department of Health and by the American Medical Association. He didn't know that it wasn't okay for grandfather to be her doctor. And he certainly didn't know that in the first 31 months of Layla's life, Dr. Garishi prescribed her 36 different prescriptions, and that he billed insurance for 56 different sick visits. This was a healthy, thriving child who constantly was prescribed these medications that he believes certainly made her sick. Because here's the rub: since Dr. Garishi has no longer been Layla's pediatrician. So just imagine, by age 2.5, she's had 36 different prescribed medications, 56 sick visits. Layla has never been sick. So it's been 2 years later. She's never been sick, and she's been prescribed nothing.
That's awful. Oh my
Again,
god.
we're
That does sound like and I'm not pronouncing it right, but how do you pronounce it? Munchausen's?
1000 by proxy.
Yeah, yes. I
Scott
guess I was
described it
close.
Scott described it so well, because we're not doctors. We can't make that
Right.
diagnosis.
No.
It was this need to be needed. That's what he believes. Almost like this God complex from these folks, and this need to be needed by both Sherry and by Layla.
Yeah, there was something psychological going on there. There's no doubt about it, which is really super scary. I can't imagine. So then at some point, Sherry's gone and he loved, by the way, I've really researched this thoroughly, and I noticed that they met in Newport, Rhode Island, and I'm actually familiar with O'Brien's Pub is where they met. I've been there multiple times. I love Newport, but she was actually engaged, I believe, to an Iranian man who the
Yeah.
parents really supported. So that there was that little angle that I noticed. But she fell madly in love with Scott. Scott fell madly in love with Sherry, and they were ultimately married. So here Scott is grieving the love of his life, and then, he's dealing with this with little Layla at the same time. So at some point he said it would be best he made the decision, he was a fit parent, that it would be best for Layla not to be with her grandparents, right?
Well, let me tell you
Yes.
about
Yes,
uh,
explain that to me. I was a little confused about that.
yeah. So again, Scott, when first of all, he's in the hospital, an emergency
Mm.
situation with his wife. He learns that all of this medical advice and medication that these parents have been giving to his wife was not accurate, was likely not in her best interest. At the hospital, when he was reporting to nurses sort of the medications that she was on and who was prescribing those medications, he looked, they would look at him like he had two heads. They couldn't believe that her own father was prescribing these medications unbeknownst to Dana-Farber. And so then he returns home. He witnesses this incident with his daughter. However, he also is conflicted. These are his in-laws. He wants to do the right thing. He's definitely a guy who wants to do the right thing,
Yeah.
but he has hesitation, and he very much is a detective, an investigator. So he begins investigating. He does not cut off visits initially at all. He just is taking time to understand what is going on here. So he does allow for I would call them supervised visits. He allows to the grandparents to
Okay.
visit with Laila while he is present.
That
And
makes sense. Yeah.
yeah, and he does so. He meets them at certain venues. There was a horseback riding venue that he invited grandmother to. He would meet them out, and ultimately, the last visit that occurred was on June 15th, before he went on a trip with Laila at a playground in Portsmouth. He learned that evening, so he's collecting information. He learns on June 15th, the grandparents' best friend's 40-year-old son calls him. He doesn't have a friendship with this man. He has some knowledge of this man because this man grew up with Sherry and is a lifelong friend of Sherry's, and is the son of the grandparents' best friends, who are also Persian Iranian, that grew up in that culture. And he calls him because he is so disturbed by what he has just heard at a dinner where he was present with his parents and the grandparents. And he tells Scott that grandmother came to this dinner and said, Scott does not stand a chance when
Wow.
when I'm with Laila, and that she planned to bankrupt him, and
Oh
that
my
she
God.
and that when she was done with him, he would not be able to afford the home that he lives in. And that witness again was going to testify at trial had we had the opportunity or were made to have the opportunity to present our witnesses. So Scott
Okay.
learned that on June 15th. So at that point, he understands that that they have a plan to potentially take Laila away from him or to sue him for something. He still does not come right out and suspend visits. He takes a trip with Laila to Mount Washington area where he was supposed to go. They had a family trip planned, and so he took Laila because obviously Sherry was past at this point. And he then learns that the grandparents are going behind his back to his family and friends and asking for them to intervene and to provide visits to them. And they're disparaging him. They're saying terrible things about him. They're saying that he's not providing visits when he really was providing visits. So when he returns home, the culmination of all of that results in him sending a message to them on July 11th that he's suspending contact,
Okay.
that he's suspending contact. 8 days later, he's served with papers for this lawsuit.
Oh my gosh. And here's a guy that tried. I think he really tried to grant them visitation, but I get it. He's got to be present, and I would insist on that too as a parent, based on what he knows.
Right.
So he
And
gets
then
served.
come to
Yeah.
find out what we know today.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. I mean, what we came to learn is astonishing, in my opinion. And I don't, I've said before, and I will say it today and publicly, I don't believe that these grandparents are safe next to a dog, never mind a child. I mean, I really, really am very, very concerned by what we've learned.
Yeah, yeah, me too, as I was researching the case, and obviously through discovery, you found out a lot more. And, so the case, well, let's talk a little bit about what happened at that proceeding. And I think all the listeners will be interested. There was a secret recording. So tell us about that.
Okay. So now the grandparents tried to suggest during the trial, or the sort of the suggestion was that Scott was depriving them visits out of spite, to be
Okay.
punitive, and that they were shocked and surprised by Scott suspending visits on July 11th, and that they believed that he did it because they had a home in Maine where Sherry and Scott spent magical memories together in the summer. It was owned by the grandparents, and they believed that Scott, because they told Scott on the day after Sherry died to move out of their summer home in Maine, that Scott was depriving visits because Scott was angry about that. And I was not allowed to ask grandparents when they first consulted with an attorney for a grandparents' rights action, because it was my belief that they had planned this long before, knowing what I knew about that June 15th conversation.
Mhm.
Um, so the grandparents, sort of to support their narrative that this was being done out of spite because of Scott's anger about a summer home in Maine, presented a recording, a secret 2-hour and
Oh my
46
god.
minute recording that was recorded in Scott's home, without his knowledge, on June 5th. What Scott came to learn, this was provided late in discovery. What Scott came
Mm.
to learn, and I came to learn, is that two women, young women, I would say in their 20s or 30s, from the Persian community, um, contacted Scott and asked if they identified themselves as old friends of Sherry, who Scott had never met. And they wanted to know whether or not, they said they were going to be in town. They lived out of state. And they wanted to know if they could come meet Layla and talk to Scott about what happened to Sherry, because they were so shocked to learn of her death. And at first, Scott was very hesitant, because by now he's concerned that maybe grandparents are surveying him, or they hadn't attended the funeral. He's not sure what's
Mhm.
going on. He's worried. So he actually asked them, um, you're not going to record me or anything. I'm a little parent, I'm a little worried that maybe, the grandparents are mounting a case or whatever. And they said, oh, absolutely not. We know nothing about that. Absolutely not. Well,
Oh, wow.
they turned on the recorder before they entered the home. They were asking questions about what happened, and Scott has no idea that he's being recorded. He says, I'm so happy you're not here to spy on me for the grandparents, when that's clearly, in fact, exactly what they were there for. He, out of the goodness of his heart, brings them into his home. He introduces them to Layla. They were not there. They seemed very little interested in
Gosh.
Layla throughout this recording, and a lot more interested in getting information for the grandparents. They then turn over that recording to the grandparents. The grandparents deny, and they deny that they were there to do that. Well, the grandparents ended up with this recording, and for some reason, they thought that this recording helped to support their suggestion, because Scott does talk about the main home. However, it's in the context of being shocked that he's asked on the day after Sherry dies. It seems to be one of the most, the thing that they're interested in, is to get him out of the main home. And by the way, when he went there, this was a summer home where they lived. Um,
Okay.
when he went there, they were very insistent that he get his belongings out of there. When he went there with his family, I'm sorry, with his friends, to move their belongings out, that would have been Sherry's effects and
Mhm.
Layla's and Scott's. Every single piece of evidence of Sherry ever existing there had already been removed.
That is weird.
All of
Why?
her clothing,
Oh
all of
my
her toothbrush, her hairbrush. There was nothing left of Sherry there. They had taken it already or destroyed it. We don't know, but it was only Layla's things there and Scott's things there.
That's
In any
so
event,
strange.
maybe that's 5 minutes of the conversation, but the rest of the conversation for that 2 hours and 46
Mhm.
minutes is everything else, is about his concerns about medication he found. He also found controlled substances in Sherry's medication cabinet in other people's names. He found Xanax in the name prescribed by Dr. Garishi to Dr. Corsand, grandfather
Wow.
to grandmother, 270 Xanax in a bottle. He also found Xanax in the name of Dr. Garishi's office manager in Sherry's medicine cabinet. So these are the things that are mounting that is concerning of him on June 5th. Still providing
Mm.
visits, still trying to be reasonable, but he expresses to them why he has some concerns about how they never came to the funeral, about how they never came to the hospital. So
Yeah.
ultimately, the court found that that one piece of evidence in the court's mind showed Scott's state of mind
Mm.
at the time prior to him suspending visits on July 11th. And ultimately, that's what the court hung its hat on in terms of deciding that the grandparents had not overcome their burden
Well,
to prove that Scott's decision to decline visits was unreasonable. After 16 days of trial, which Margaret, as you know, is
mhm.
longer than most murder trials.
Yeah.
Um, I'm a former public defender. You're a former
Former
prosecutor.
prosecutor.
Right. So longer than most murder trials, the court, one piece of evidence that the court found that hung its hat on was that recording. It certainly showed
Yeah.
that that this didn't come out of nowhere, and it certainly showed that there was some surveillance going on, or a plan or a design by grandparents, and it showed
Mm.
Scott's state of mind at the time as it related to why he suspended visits at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it really backfired as far as the grandparents are concerned.
Yeah, it was funny when we
Yeah.
first got it in Discovery, I played it over and over and over
Yeah.
again. I said, I don't I can see, I guess maybe because he talked about the main home experience. I said, but I don't see how this helps them. I see that this helps us. And then we were able to also cross-examine the woman who took the video, who
Oh,
testified
okay.
that I'm sorry, that she took the audio because she wanted to give it to her mother, but it wasn't, to at least in my mind, that was not a very credible testimony. It was very clear to, I think, most people who were listening that this
Mhm.
woman was made to go there to get this audio tape for the grandparents and for uh, a lawsuit that they were planning.
Yeah, and how did they do it? Was it on their phone? Was it
It
on
was
the girl's
it
phone?
it was on their phone, and in fact,
Mhm.
one of the most chilling parts of the audio is at the very end when you can hear, it was 2 sisters, when you can hear one of the sisters saying, "I feel bad. He seems like a really nice guy."
Ooh, that helped. That probably helped in
I think it
court.
all helped. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and what is legally in Rhode Island? Because of course it goes state by state. So what does the law say about grandparents' rights and about parental rights in general? What was the judge looking at as far as the law?
So our statute is written pretty in a pretty interesting way, and it's been amended several times. And we've made some constitutional challenges to the way that it's written. But essentially, what it says is that there is a presumption that grandparents, petitioners, would have to overcome, that a father's decision, a parent's decision to
Mhm.
suspend visits is reasonable. So they have to
Okay.
overcome that presumption in order for the court then to look at the best interests of a child in awarding visitation to grandparents. And we've
Mm.
challenged that because parenting is a fundamental constitutional right. That's what the United States Supreme Court has said over and over and over again in various cases. But as it relates to grandparent visitation, Troxel is the case decided over
Okay.
20 years ago.
Yep.
And and we believe, and we have argued, that in order to for a state or a government to interfere with your right to make decisions for your child, there that should not be the standard. So we have other constitutional rights: the right to bear arms, our First Amendment rights
Mhm.
of speech. In order for a government to interfere with those fundamental constitutional rights, it is our argument, and this has been the successful argument in other states that have overturned their own statutes or modified their own statutes, that there has to be a showing of harm, not just an analysis of what is in a child's best interest, but if there is you either have to prove that a parent is unfit. In this case, they conceded that Scott was fit, and having been a practitioner for 30 years, I can tell you he's one of the most wonderful fathers I've ever had the pleasure of representing in my life.
That's
Um,
nice.
but you also have to prove that the child would be harmed by not having visits with the grandparents, and that's not the Rhode Island standard, and we
Okay.
believe it should be. So we've made a constitutional challenge, both as it's written, but also as applied. One of the things that the justices warned about in Troxel in the United States Supreme Court decision was this disparity of resources, and we saw that in real life applied to
Hmm.
the David and Goliath fight. We've got a civil servant up against multi-million dollar doctors who have all the resources in the world. And if you can think about that, even across the United States, parents who may be fighting these kinds of battles with grandparents, 9 times out of 10, grandparents have much more resources than parents who for legitimate reasons don't want their children visiting with grandparents.
You're absolutely right.
And it's a
You know.
huge burden shift, right? So this is a
Hmm.
constitutional right where the burden shifted to Scott, where he incurred fees and time in excess of $500,000, 2 years
Awful.
out of work, hasn't had an opportunity to grieve, to really, while it says that the burden is on the grandparents, the burden was certainly on Scott in this case, and
Yeah.
it was horrific. It was a nightmare for him.
Oh yeah. And I think you're right in challenging this.
We're really, sort of optimistic that
Good.
that procedurally we filed what's called an emergency petition for cert, and
Oh,
those are
good.
very, very rare. They're very rare, and we
Yes.
filed it in the middle of the trial, and we asked the Supreme Court to step in and just dismiss the case on constitutional grounds. And we, sort of statistically would have anticipated that they would have dismissed, denied our motion mid-trial, but they didn't. They said,
Mm.
keep us posted. We want to know what the judge decides next. And so when the judge denied all of our same motions below in the family court, they then dismissed the case. The judge, 2 days
Right.
later, dismissed the case based on my motion to dismiss midway through the trial. I then, of
And that's
course,
quite a win. You did a great job there, and because it's hard to win on a motion to dismiss. So
yeah,
that's kudos to you on
thank
on
you.
on that. That's
Thank you.
amazing. So, for listeners out there, um, can you explain the procedure? Because I people these days that listen, and again, this video lives on the internet, and people really like to learn about the law and what, especially family court versus, regular court. But explain procedurally what your motion to dismiss did. Like, where were you guys in the trial when you made the motion to dismiss that was granted?
That's why I love your concept, Margaret. I love that you are translating, the law for lay people so that they understand from a legal standpoint sort of what happened here. That very much excites me.
Thank you.
Um, um, so I sort of had this plan the entire time, and I think that I was born for this case. I was a former public defender for a decade before I transitioned into family court, but I've always had that foundation of civil rights and constitution as my passion, and litigation experience in front of juries that family court practitioners never experience. And the experience with burdens.
Mhm.
In here, very uniquely to any other family, divorce law or any other family court proceeding, at least as it relates on what we would call the domestic side, not the juvenile criminal side or anything like that. I understood that there was a burden, which is sort of a hurdle that the grandparents had to get over in order for the trial to continue once they put on all of their witnesses. So I was really waiting for them to get done with putting on all of their witnesses when they rested their case.
Yep.
And it was
Okay.
that I was ready to make the argument to the court. And at first I was thinking strategically, should I warn the other side who are not, who don't have a criminal defense background and may not understand what's coming, or should I not? But ultimately I decided I wanted to let them know that this was coming, and I wanted the court to know that this was coming. Now, uniquely, our judge was also a prosecutor, so I knew
Oh,
that
good.
he would understand. I knew
Yeah.
that he would
Yeah.
understand. So as they started to finish up with their last witness, which happened to be the grandfather's office manager, I told the court that I intended on arguing a motion to dismiss after they rested. And I told the attorneys, the opposing counsel for the grandparents, that I was going to be arguing this motion to dismiss. It's my belief that grandparents' attorneys were not prepared for that. I argued for an hour and a half. They stood up for about 5 minutes and said, no, you shouldn't dismiss it. I argued for an hour and a half in advance saying, here's everything that you've heard. Not one piece of testimony in 16 days should have convinced this court that they've met their burden to prove that my client's decision is unreasonable. And that's what they would have had to have done before they rested their side of the case, before you make us call the 16 witnesses that we have teed up to testify in this case. Please don't let this go on for another moment. And I could tell that the judge had really given it a lot of thought when he sort of brought out some documents. He could have just said, nope, denied, and call your first witness. But I could tell he had given it a lot of thought, and he went on for close to an hour and a half with a decision as to why.
Oh, that's great. And you must have presented him with a great memorandum of law on the whole issue too, prior.
I actually argued orally. There were many memorandums of law, but procedurally what was going on at that point, don't forget, is the Supreme Court case was still pending as well. So to this day, as we sit here, they have not decided whether or not they're going to take cert. And I find it a bit exciting that after the case was dismissed, I reported again back to the Supreme Court. Well, the case was dismissed today, but I would really, really love you. There is precedence in Rhode Island that allows them to still keep the case in the Supreme Court to consider the constitutionality of the statute. And I argued, pursuant to that precedence, that, hey, we understand that this case is dismissed. And so, yes, you could find that our issues are moot now, but you don't have to, because this is a constitutional challenge. If you find that this is a matter of great public interest and that there is the risk of repeated harm to others in facing this unconstitutional statute, you may keep this case and you may decide it. And again, I fully expect statistically that they would say, thanks, but no thanks. We're dismissing it on moot grounds, but they didn't. They asked for the grandparents' attorney to respond, and that was on May 4th. And as we sit here today, we still have not learned whether or not they will take the case on cert. And I'm excited. I hope they really look at it.
I think they should look at it for the public interest. And you said it very, very well. It's something very important to other families, other parents in Rhode Island. And it actually, a case like this could have national implications, right? Other states, you never know, could be dealing with a statute similar to Rhode Island's, and maybe the law really does need to change here. So
they are. So I've, of course, there's been an influx of people who are facing the same concerns with grandparent rights challenges in Rhode Island. And I've certainly received an influx of calls from other potential cases as it relates to Rhode Island citizens. But this is happening across the United States. These statutes are being looked at very, very carefully. We had some wonderful meetings with an attorney named David DeLucas. He is the founder of Parents USA, and he goes across the United States and challenges these statutes and challenges them successfully. So in Idaho in 2022, same sort of a statute overturned for the same reason. for the same
Oh,
arguments
wow.
that this is not just a best interest of a child standard when you're talking about your constitutional rights. You have to show that the child would actually be harmed before a
Mhm.
court can come in and take your child away and give them to grandparents for visitation.
I
And he,
agree.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, that should be the standard. I'll have to look for him and see if I can get him on as well because, I follow a lot of murder cases and things like that, but I think people have to deal with family court. And there's so many issues, either a divorce or custody issues. So it's a big part of people's lives out there.
yes,
Yeah.
I personally think it's a broken system and it needs a
Mhm.
lot of reform. And it's something I'm very impassioned about as I sort of in my last years of my career. I want to focus on how we can do better and how we can reform. And this
Mhm.
case has definitely been an inspiration for sure.
Last years of your career, no way.
I am so
You're way too young
I'm
for
so
that.
tired. I'm so burnt out. I'm so tired. I left the public defender's office, which I really, really love doing because I didn't want to be so emotionally attached to cases as I was then. And this case, almost killed me. Really, it was. What the court doesn't understand is this was 20-hour days in my large house. Every single surface was covered with hundreds of thousands of medical documents. This really almost killed me, but
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
I'm
Eh
I'm I'm so
yeah.
happy for this family who has become like family to me. I'm so happy for this man. I'm so proud of him for
Yeah.
fighting this fight and enduring it. And it's not over. I'd like to
No.
highlight that there are 4 complaints pending against these grandparents with the Department of Health. One that was filed by the Boston Globe, one that was filed by Scott, but then one that was filed by the chief of the Board of Medical Licensure of Rhode Island for the delivery of controlled substances from grandfather. And then finally, 2 days before the case was dismissed, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Rhode Island filed a complaint about alleging insurance fraud.
Wow.
Because as a doctor, you are not ever allowed to run insurance claims for family members because it's unethical to treat family members. And so they have literature right on point that says you cannot charge Blue Cross Blue Shield for the treatment of your families because it's unethical. And he did so hundreds and hundreds of times for Scott, who alleges that he was never treated by Dr. Garishi. There are 57 insurance claims
Mm.
that Scott found in his name, hundreds of times for Laila and 56 times for Laila and over 100 times for his daughter.
Wow.
Not to mention he upcharged them. So not
Mhm.
only would it be the regular charge, but he would also charge them for giving them medical care at night and on weekends, on off hours, which is just fascinating.
Yeah, and most people don't know about the rules of a doctor, what they can and cannot do. We don't know, we're patients, right?
Right.
So I'm sure Scott had no idea.
He had no idea.
But wow, and what did the Boston Globe file? I think that's interesting.
And this was when when the case, long before I was involved. I was not involved until um numerous months in. So the court had already ordered that Scott had to provide visits to the grandparents early on. This case went on for almost 2 years. So this case began in July of 2024. Um, and on the very first day that Scott was in court, the court ordered supervised visits, and Scott was devastated. Um, and um, at some point, the Boston Globe got word of sort of what was going on, and a reporter there, Amanda Malkovich, who's an amazing reporter,
Mhm.
this became very interesting to her. And when she heard Scott's story and Scott started to get the medical documentation of what really went on here, she took it and ran with it. And she was so concerned that she filed the first complaint. And then Scott filed his own complaint. And then the chief of the board filed their own complaint.
That's
Now,
crazy.
it's a little frustrating to know that those have not been heard yet. The Department of Health has stated that they did not want to engage in those proceedings until the trial is over. The trial is over, and so we very much hope that they will take a very serious look at these complaints, because that could be the path to criminal charges.
Oh, yeah.
The
Yeah, I
Department
wonder if we're gonna see that
the
because
Department of Health can, and in my opinion should,
Mhm.
then once their investigation is over, refer at least the delivery of a controlled substances, the unauthorized delivery of controlled substances allegations, and the alleged insurance fraud to the Attorney General's office, we hope. Because
Yeah.
one of the
Yeah.
parts of this case is that Scott went everywhere for help. He went to his local police department. He went to the state police. He went to the Attorney General's office. He went to the Department of Health with his concerns, and no one has done anything yet.
Yeah, and there's Scott right there. That's well, sometimes it takes a little bit longer, I think, for some of those departments to respond, but it'll be interesting, and this has made national news, so you can read online, there's People Magazine, what was it, Good Morning America, so
Nightline.
big national shows have been talking about this case, and of course, Boston Globe and the New England newspapers, so I think the grandparents are gonna be in trouble, we'll
I hope so.
say.
I hope
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, because you can't do this. And of course, insurance fraud is a big one too. I actually did, civil defense work for insurance companies at one point, so, yeah, I would think that they would be seriously looking into this.
I'm a big believer that your dark hours can be gifts. I
Yeah.
think, I tell Scott this is sort of the poster child for the American Medical Association. This is such a cautionary tale. They have a rule right on point about why you do not treat family members. And this is, in my opinion, the poster child for why you don't. Your judgment gets blurred. You practice outside the scope of your practice. I mean, at one point, I believe that the grandmother testified that she also thought that she was Sherry's therapist.
Oh,
She believed
god.
to be Sherry's therapist. She was telling her daughter not to see a doctor at all, and that she was just withdrawing from Prozac up until the last days of her life. One of Sherry's last text messages to her parents that she loved was, "You said I would be okay."
Mm.
Devastating. You said I would be fine.
Is it possible? Of course, I'm just, surmising here, but I wonder if at some point the grandparents knew that if Sherry did go to a therapist or another doctor, that doctor would be like, "Wait a minute, why are there all these prescriptions?" And maybe they thought they'd be in trouble. So maybe that's why. Maybe
Well,
they
we
were
talked to her other
covering for
doctors.
themselves.
Yeah, we talked to her other doctors, and so the fascinating part is that they had no idea. We had her general practitioner and her nurse practitioner who were going to testify. We had
Mm.
no idea. It's a requirement. First of all, the law says you cannot prescribe, you cannot treat your family members. If you do, in very limited circumstances, in emergency circumstances, you must immediately report what you're prescribing to their actual providers. That's what Dr. Gurishi did not do. And then he had the audacity, in my opinion, to blame Sherry from the stand for that. He said, "Well, I told her to tell the doctors. I told my daughter, a layperson, when I was prescribing her 124 medications over the course of the last 10 years, I just assumed she did it." And she
Oh
didn't.
my gosh. He was definitely I mean, it sounds to me like he was covering for himself because he either my guess is he consulted with an attorney or realized, "You know what? We could be in huge trouble." And it's very interesting to me that they stopped practicing medicine at that point. So,
Well,
what does that tell you?
to be clear, and you can read it in the transcripts. They had a lawyer, a medical malpractice attorney, seated in the courtroom every single day of the trial. Um,
Mhm.
However, from a criminal defense standpoint, I was fascinated by some of what the grandparents were allowed to testify with their attorney sitting there, I'm sure concerned about liability. So the
Oh,
attorney
yeah.
who representing them in the Department of Health complaints was seated there and on the clock for 16 days of 8-hour days of trial, observing the case.
Wow. Wow. That's that's crazy. And I think in family court the rules are a little bit more relaxed, right? As far as objections? How did you find that to be compared to a criminal court?
Every day I find it to be wildly frustrating.
Yeah.
I think that we go to school, many of us go to law school because we are rule followers. We like to master the rules and then we like
Mhm.
to apply them. And for certain reasons in family court, probably because it is in litigants' best interest when they're going through a divorce to mediate and to resolve things quickly. The rules are very relaxed. I was happy to have, I think, a judge who understands those rules and applies them more frequently because he came from a system where those are required, and that would be because he had been a former prosecutor. But generally speaking, this statute is so unique that it has a burden and it has um, legal implications that a divorce doesn't have, or a child support case doesn't have. So yes, I find it very frustrating that the rules of evidence are relaxed in some ways, or the
Mhm.
procedural rules are relaxed in some way. But I do think that this judge in particular did the best he could with just a mammoth of a case.
Mm. Oh, yeah. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's now, I wanna also talk about I like to talk about, obviously, the law, but I think part of the system as a whole is the human side, whether you're in criminal court or family court, and so many of these people, like Scott, or victims of crime, people who have to testify, I like to talk about resilience, and how is Scott doing today, and Layla? As far as, how does he get through this?
I get choked up thinking about this,
Yeah,
but
I know. I like to talk about resilience. Tell me about what Scott does as far as how he gets through. He's a single dad and he still has to work and dealing with all of this court stuff. How did he do it?
um again, I will speak to his village. To
Mm.
suggest the grandparents tried to suggest Layla needed them in their lives. The grandmother said something very creepy at some point, I thought, in her testimony, that Layla deserves to be loved by me.
Oh,
Um so Scott is surrounded. Scott's parents, who by the way were not allowed to visit frequently because that was an order by the grandparents when during their marriage, are wonderful, kind, supporting, uh, blue collar people in the Massachusetts area. They are wonderful. Scott's friends and are the most amazing village of support that I've really I rarely have ever seen being in my realm. I always tell my clients, hey, listen, this is a dark hour. You have to be surrounded by your village. Scott's village is amazing. He has friends who, Layla calls aunties and uncles
oh,
that are his dear friends. And so I think that he wouldn't be standing today if it wasn't for his village. In terms of
yeah.
his personal perseverance and pursuit of justice, I
Mm-hmm.
remember before the trial began, um, making Scott meet me on the top of the garage of the courthouse and begging him to consider a settlement.
Oh,
Um,
wow. Okay.
and I I was all in after he said that not all the money in the world would he accept because his daughter was not for sale. And it was that
Mm.
at that moment I was like, I'm going to give my absolute all. I missed Thanksgiving with my family. I missed Easter with
Oh
my
my
family because
gosh.
I was going to give my all to this client. It was an enormous toll on our practice, but at that moment he had sold me. Um,
Yeah.
so he's still standing. I think that we're both so relieved that this part is over, just because from the standpoint of thinking that he might have to hand over by a court order this precious child to those people, that part is over, but it's not over for Scott. He really is interested in the pursuit of justice, in protecting other families from these statutes, in pursuing justice for Sherry and pursuing justice for Layla. And I don't think it's going to stop. And I really have tremendous respect for him. But he, at the same time, he needs to grieve. It's been 2 years and he hasn't had that opportunity because he's been in war mode this entire time trying to protect his family. And he, the dust is sort of just settling, but it's been a devastating experience for him. And I don't know where he'll end up financially broken and but he is very resilient and very strong and very determined. And I have a lot of respect for him.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, you have been so enlightening to the audience, and you were great. But you were
Thank
just
you.
amazing, and I learned so much. That's why I do this as well, because I learn, and I didn't really know about the Rhode Island statute and what's the burdens were across the country. So I really enjoyed researching this and learning about the case, and I applaud you for all the work you did on it for Scott, and hopefully it will be an example across the nation. So,
We hope
thank
so.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and, thank you so much, and I'll, I'd love to have you on again sometime. I think you were excellent as a guest, and I know my audience will appreciate it. So, and also, by the way, everybody, press this subscribe button and the like button. We'd really appreciate it. We both put a lot of effort into presenting this, episode for you, and with that, I hope you have a lovely weekend, everyone. And so stay with me for a moment and I'll end the stream. And again, thank you so much to the audience for watching The Margaret McLean Show. I'm your courtroom translator. And again, have a lovely weekend, and I'll catch you next time.